welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of interest to the Guyanese public, both at home and in the diaspora. And I think many of us will be interested in what is taking place between the PPP and the Indigenous community. Many of us have seen over the last 30 years, nothing sudden. We've seen scenes of scores of Indigenous people picketing Parliament, picketing the PPPC government ministries, picketing National House Council meetings, and you might wonder what is going on. From the time that the PPP decided to rename the Temeri International Airport the Chedi Jagan International Airport, you've seen the demonstrations of Indigenous people who were angry. They're not so much angry at the fact that the airport was renamed, but the fact that they claim to have been consulted when in fact they were not consulted. We've seen the American People's Association, the APA, having to resort to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We've seen the APA taking to the streets, taking to the courts, taking to international organizations to challenge the PPP civic. What is taking place? Why is the PPP waging a war against the American People's Association? We all know that the United Nations pays particular attention to the Indigenous people in all the countries around the world, not just in Guyana, because almost every country that is occupied by Europeans and other foreigners, or even local people, have issues with the Indigenous population. And the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People provides a framework for reconciliation and for healing and for peace. The United Nations affirms that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, while retaining their right to participate fully, if they choose, in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state. This is a human rights issue. This is not a question of political preference or political alignment. This is basic human rights. Indigenous people do have rights. And you have Indigenous people in Africa, Asia, in South America. In Guyana, every common entrance student, pupil knows that there are 9 indigenous nations or groups: the Akawai, Kuna, Arawak, Carib, Makoshi, Patmona, Waiwai, Wapishana, Warao. And in total, there are about 78,000, and they constitute about 10.5% of the national population. So it's a significant group. And we know that many Indigenous people live in the hinterland, but they have huge human development hurdles to overcome. And we need to understand that before we jump to conclusions about, what the people in the bush, feel and think. The APA is a legitimate non-governmental organization, and it was established, 33 years ago, and it aims at supporting community initiatives, at addressing human rights violations, improving the general conditions under which Indigenous people live. It aims at promoting the social, economic, and political and cultural development of Indigenous communities in solidarity with one another, not in isolation, certainly not in conflict, and promoting and defending the rights of Indigenous people. That is what it's all about. It's not a political organization. It is a non-governmental organization which is aimed at defending the rights of Indigenous people. But the APA has had to make certain accusations against the PPP over the years, 33 years, because it feels that the PPP ignores its recommendations for Indigenous peoples. The APA has been unable to meet, it says, with government to discuss issues of Indigenous people's rights. After the administration change in August 2020, they did have a meeting, but apart from that preliminary meeting, they have not been given access to continuous or repetitive meetings with the Minister of Indigenous. Well, they call it now Minister of Women Affairs. We call it the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples Affairs. But that is not the source of the conflict. The PPP, on the other hand, dismisses and discredits the APA. It says that the APA is aligned to the opposition. Well, I don't know which opposition is aligned to the APA. The APA makes decisions for itself. I've never seen the APA, as a sort of branch of the APNU or the PNC or any other opposition party. So this is, really is a figment of the PPP imagination. The PPP, of course, relies very heavily on the electoral support of indigenous communities because the demographic changes over the last 30 years have brought down the ethnic Indian support. So Guyana actually is a nation of minorities. So the PPP is not the ethnic, in the East Indian community is not a majority, and the African community is not a majority. So if any party wants to win a majority purely based on ethnic support, it has to cross the border. And the PPP has shown a lot of interest over the last decade in the indigenous community, and it does get support from the indigenous community. That is how it can get 52% of the vote, So when the PPP accuses the APA of being aligned to the opposition, these are the grounds for war because the PPP wants a majority. Everybody wants a majority. And in this situation, the PPP relies heavily, very heavily, on the support of indigenous communities. Right now, it controls the 4 municipalities which were established by the APNU AFC coalition between 2015 and 2020. It has control of all 4, Mabaruma, Bartica, Madia, and Lethem, which says something about the effort that is put in on the ground. And it has control of most of the RDCs and NDCs. So the PPP has been doing a lot of groundwork in the hinterland and in the indigenous communities. And it says something for the PPP's ability to get votes, to squeeze votes out of the hinterland. It cultivates, you could almost call it a vote farm, in which it gets those majorities. So there's tremendous influence. And the influence is not just on the ground, it also in the NDC, the National Tushaus Council. And some of the Tushaus are aligned to the PPP. So this is not necessarily a setting for war. It should be a setting for consensus, but the PPP not right now interested in that type of consensus, interested in victory, interested in confrontation, interested in winning. Why is there controversy between the PPP and APA? Is the PPP at war with the Amerindian Peoples Association? I don't know all of the answers, but I have selected 10 areas. I think the indigenous people, or at least the Amerindian Peoples Association, is mostly concerned with land and environmental security. Now, many of you who have gone to the hinterland would know the indigenous people are not interested in house lots. They're interested in land. And right now, the indigenous people legally possess a substantial part of Guyanese territory, maybe close to 18%. This change occurred because of the efforts of the People's National Congress since 1966. It entered office in 1964, 60 years ago. And it launched an inquiry, Amerindian Lands Commission, and under the Amerindian Lands Commission, a lot of the land that were owned by the churches, particularly the Anglican and the Catholic churches, and private ranchers, was returned to the indigenous people. And again, when you think of the Rupununi Rebellion in 1969, the whole purpose of the rebellion at that time was to prevent the government or prevent the Amerindian Lands Commission from giving back to the Amerindian people the land which they had traditionally owned. But most of the Rupununi was taken up by what is called, the Brazilian word is fazenda. The Spanish word is hacienda. But many of the ranchers in Rupununi, and I think we must deal with the Rupununi Rebellion one these days, they employed the indigenous people as vaqueros, as cowboys. But the big haciendas were owned by people who didn't consider themselves Amerindian, although they had mixed Amerindian blood. But I'm drifting away from the subject. But right now, the indigenous people are concerned mostly about land and the environment. And that process was kicked off by the PNC, the Amerindian Lands Commission, in the 1960s, soon after the PNC got into office. Now, the situation at present is basically can basically be reduced to 10 issues. One is the carbon credits. Now, the PPP has a monetized approach to the environment. They don't preserve or protect the environment, to provide a good living, clean water, trees, and fresh air. They want money from the environment. Nothing wrong with wanting money, but I think the PPP takes it to extremes. The APA disagrees with the way the PPP is managing what it calls the carbon credit schemes. As you know, certain international organizations and industrialized countries actually provide funds to compensate countries for not cutting down trees. And because the trees, particularly the trees in Guyana, trees in the Guyana Shield, are actually the lungs of the earth. They help earth to breathe. So industrialized countries pollute the environment, but the trees in the Guyana Shield and in Guyana help to absorb the carbon dioxide and prevent earth from overheating. But the APA doesn't agree with the PPP attitude to managing a carbon credit, and particularly in sharing out the financial benefits or the proceeds from carbon credit. Whereas the APNU AFC had supported what is called the Green State Development Strategy, which is a holistic and comprehensive plan. The PPP has a more narrow, low carbon development strategy, the LCDS. This is money. They want to sell the benefits of the environmental, I would call, the protection of the environment to get cash. It works. But many indigenous communities do not accept the PPP explanation or the PPP model because they've been told, they've been told that you either accept the PPP benefit sharing scheme or receive nothing at all. And so indigenous communities are obliged to accept what the PPP is selling as the carbon credit scheme, or they get nothing. So many of them accept the scheme, you can almost say under duress, or else, it's coming from their lands. The protection of the trees in their communities help to earn but they don't agree with the method that the PPP is using. So the carbon credit scheme is a major source of difference, if not controversy, between the PPP and the APA. The second issue is an issue of communication. Now, many persons who are not born indigenous, they live in indigenous communities, may not understand that many indigenous people do not speak English as their first language. I personally have been to places, I've spoken to a schoolhouse full of Guyanese indigenous people who do not understand English, and I had to get an interpreter. And many of my campaigns in Region 8, Region 9, Region 1, um, with indigenous people required interpreters. So although some younger uh, indigenous children may go to school and speak English, they learn English in school, many of the older folk do not speak English as the first language. And there's some areas in Barimawaini where children don't even go to school because they do not speak English and the teachers do not speak Warao or Karen. Uh, so we mustn't take this for granted. Sometimes you see, signs like policia on the police vehicles. I think they've been erased now because of the number of Venezuelan migrants coming into the country. But many police officers, many government servants do not understand the indigenous languages of the people in the regions where they work. And this is the problem. So what the APA is saying and what the APA has complained, if you're going to provide complicated carbon credit schemes, they need to be explained to the people in languages that they understand, because the schemes are not simple and they need to have consultations in which the indigenous language of the residents is used, and, and languages that they could understand. Now, bearing in mind that there are 9 indigenous groups, and some of them are not mutually intelligible, they cannot understand one another necessarily. Some are related, some are similar, but some are not. And many of the government servants who put out these schemes do not themselves speak the language which the people understand. So this is one of the things that the APA is insisting. It has complained to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that the National Two-Shows Council was presented with a resolution to endorse the administration's carbon program. But many leaders did not have an opportunity to comprehend or to consult or to seek the consent of their own communities. So they could not craft responses. They could not go back to their communities, discuss it with their members, and then come back to say, these are our recommendations. This is how we feel that the benefits should be deployed. So the communications problem is the second big problem between the APA and the PPPC. The third issue is the question of consent and coercion. The APA insists, in accordance with all the conventions we're aware of, that for participation to be effective, the indigenous people must be provided with adequate time and information, again, in an understandable language that a language that they understand. And they must get technical support. They must have legal and other support to guide them in making decisions, so they could understand what the implications are before they can make decisions affecting the land. Well, government has got, attorneys and accountants and, scientific personnel, and many indigenous people don't have access to those people. So the PPP simply claimed that they don't have to consult the APA about anything. They consult the National Thresholds Council, but again, the PPP tries to control or influence or dominate some members of the NDC. NDC people are community leaders, but all of them are not members of the PPP. They're not members of the APA, but they don't have a mandate to make decisions for what takes place in the indigenous communities. The NTC has a different mandate, but the communities are their rights and privileges are clearly defined in the Amerindian Act. Another question from which conflict arises is that the APA claims that the environmental and social costs of mining and logging have to be borne by the indigenous people themselves. And many of the mining companies are controlled by a small group of persons who hold the mining permits. So there's always conflict between the communities and the companies. And the APA has been, I don't want to use the word war, but they have a different approach to mining and logging. So they're in conflict with the Guyana Gold and Diamond Miners Association. And, you can look at the environmental record of the GGDMA to see, what its environmental record has been. And deforestation is caused by mining and logging to a large extent. When you go in the hinterland communities, you see what happens to the rivers, what happens to the river banks, what happens to the forests, what these huge holes in the ground, looking like abscesses when you fly over Region 7 and Region 8. It's a big concern. The other question that has created controversy between the AP and the PPP is the question of control. The PPP has a policy which you can call a handout policy. It is not a national development strategy. It is based on short term. And when people are poor and needy, and you provide a few black tanks and a few, plastic bags, hampers, and so on, they will accept it naturally because they need it. But that is not a strategy. Basically, indigenous communities have very deep-rooted problems of alienation, problems of crime, problems of economic stagnation, problems of infrastructural inadequacy. I think very soon you will hear about another safari in Region 8. Region 8 doesn't have a proper infrastructure. You can only go from east to west in Region 8 with a safari, with ATVs or SUVs. But there are no roads there that are worthy of the name. You cannot travel Rupununi from north to south, from Anaita Shalton, because there's no highway. You have roads and they pay contractors every year after the rainy season to rehabilitate the road. But it's been going on from time immemorial. Infrastructural development is taking place at Conversation Tree in Blackbush Boulder. Is that taking place in Region 7, Region 8? And that is a big problem. Transportation is a big problem. And the PPP doesn't spend its infrastructure dollars in those regions that the RDCs control, Region 1, 7, 8, and 9. Spends it in Region 6. There's a problem of migration. Nobody knows who is in charge of migration. Venezuelan migrants keep coming over the border, and some of them live in squalor. Again, there's a question of poverty. Many indigenous people are poor. I've been to some communities, you see a whole school of children without proper footwear, without proper dental care. There's problem of substance abuse. And of course, in Region 8, it's probably one of the significant areas for marijuana cultivation, and unfortunately it trickles down into young people. There's a question of subsistence existence. which people cannot get their commodities to the markets because there are no roads. And there's just so much that you can get into a Corial or a boat. And many people have to live hand to mouth because they cannot produce their goods in marketable quantities, and the distance from the market is inhibiting factor. They have to sell to middlemen who sometimes don't pay them properly, don't pay them what they need to survive. And you're talking about over 220, maybe 240 indigenous communities if you include some of the satellites. It is a difficult task to provide adequate infrastructure for people in those scattered communities. And some of those communities are distant from one another. And of course, as a result of that, there's a lot of unemployment, and sometimes people drift to the mining areas or the logging areas. And as you know, some of them get sucked into unsavory aspects of employment, I don't need to go further, and some of them are victims of trafficking in persons. These issues of poverty, of alienation, of crime, of infrastructural inadequacy require a different approach. This is not something for carbon credits. This requires a national defense planning. Then there's the question of environmental stewardship. Now, many indigenous people are really concerned about clean and safe water. They regard, like everybody else, everywhere, clean and safe water is a human right. It's not some option that only people who get service from GWI will enjoy. It's a basic human right. And there is no mechanism by which communities could prevent some of the loggers and miners particularly from messing up their source of water, sometimes their only source of water. And when you see what happened, during the recent drought, in which, cassava of all commodities had to be sent in from the coastland to the hinterland, you can see that the water is a big problem, and transportation is a big problem. And these are not problems you could just ignore or dismiss. These are serious problems when you have to take cassava into the hinterland. And some people don't realize the seriousness of that problem. So the question of carbon credits has not resonated with some indigenous communities. One leader actually said, and let me quote his words, "We have not seen any proof that selling carbon is helping Mother Earth. Even though the government is selling carbon credits and promising to keep the trees standing, the government continues to give out mining concessions without caring about the destruction of our forests." So it is apparently a paradox that here you have a government committed to environmental stewardship and environmental security, but it is allowing the very activities which destroy the environment and then claiming to get credits. The point is, at the end of the day, many indigenous people feel, well, our communities would have been destroyed. What's the point giving us cash when our land has been destroyed? So that is another big issue between the APA and the PPPC. The question of land. People in the diaspora or people in the coastland may not understand or appreciate how important land is to most of our indigenous communities, 220 or more indigenous communities. APA conducted a land tenure assessment, LTA. It shows that there is widespread land insecurity. It compiled complaints about how the PPPC has violated the principles, what they call FPIC, free, prior, informed consent. And it carried these complaints to another acronym, ART, Architecture for Red Plus Transaction. And this itself is contributory to another acronym called TREES. The red, that's REDD, Environmental Excellence Standard. The APA has complained that the carbon credit certification process has left a lot of land tenure issues unresolved. And it feels that the PPP has not complied with the requirements for the ART and the TREES, those two important acronyms. As a result, American People's Association has had legal recourse to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the United Nations Committee on the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, that is the IACHR and the UNCRD. And those institutions have actually written to the government of Guyana, not necessarily accepting everything the APA has put before them, but asking that the government remedy the violations committed against Indigenous people. Let me mention briefly three important geographical areas. One is what is taking place at a place called Chinese Landing, which is in Region 1. It's a Carib community located on the Barama River. Second, at Marudi Mountain, which is a Wapishan community located in Region 9. And the Marudi is regarded as a sacred mountain, not only spiritually, but the fact is that many important rivers have their sources in the Marudi Mountains. So if you have mining taking place there, and the rivers are polluted, everything downstream will be polluted. Everything downstream will be contaminated. And the third area is at the Seneru, which is a Region 7, is an Akawayo community, in which the APA had to approach the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, IACHR. So you have communities which are under threat, Carib communities, Wapishan communities, and Akawayo communities. And I would say that the only representation, or the greatest representation, for Indigenous members of those three communities has come from the American People's Association. Another complaint is that the AP has been accused of political partisanship and using donor funds for its own benefit. Well, it is well known that the APA is a non-governmental organization. It does receive funding from international organizations. But that should not be used to divide the Indigenous communities among themselves. And the other point is that the AP is concerned about the territorial security. That is because they live on the borders. And some people are living in fear because they don't know what is taking place between the government of Guyana and the government of Venezuela. Sometimes they hear about the Argyle Agreement and all that, but unless things are translated in languages that they understand. In the north, you have Carib and Warao. In the center, you have Akawayo and Arakuna. In the south, you have Wapishan and Makushi. And people need to know what is taking place on their borders. All these communities are technically border or frontier communities. And they're concerned about how the Warao migration has been managed or mismanaged, or it's just been left unmanaged. So in closing, we can look at the costs and the consequences of this so-called controversy. I don't want to call it a war, but the APA and the PPP have fundamental differences in their approach. I think they're two different world views. They're two different cultures. The PPP, if we can call it, has a red policy. It's driven by cash. It is driven by party political control, winning the vote. It is encouraged by the need to dominate all these NDCs and RDCs and municipalities. APA has what I call a green policy. It is driven by land. It's driven by environment. It's driven by grassroots consensual approaches by the communities themselves. It's red versus green all over again. The PPP has a totalistic mindset. It controls the institutions in these communities. This totalistic mindset has resulted in damage to social cohesion. I would say that the indigenous community is more divided now than ever before among the various groups and communities that I mentioned. There's disdain for infrastructural improvement. If you want to see infrastructure, you have to go to Conversation Tree, go to Blackbush Pool, go to East Kanji. But when you go to Region 8, it's a safari. Go with an ATV or an SUV. The PPP has a different approach to the destruction of the environment. Mining and logging destroy the environment. And there has been no plan to implement corrective action or restorative action in these areas. The APNU had created something called a Corps of Wardens to go and inspect to ensure that there's proper environmental stewardship, but the Corps of Wardens have been dismissed. So you get a lot of accidents in the mining areas, and you have environmental destruction continuing. And this is what the APA is concerned about, especially in the mining and logging zone. And there's disrespect. There is disrespect for Tushaus in communities which are not beholden to the PPP, which don't cooperate with the PPP. And the people are treated in a very disdainful manner. So we see that the PPP for 3 decades has been waging a war against the Amerindian Peoples Association. This war hurts the environment, it hurts the communities, it hinders the right of the indigenous people to a good life, to a green environment in the land of their birth. I hope that this war can be brought to an end and all the people of Guyana could enjoy this great environment that we've inherited from our foreparents. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Let us cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must